Louisiana, 1932. The summer heat pressed down on Cypress Creek like a damp cloth, smothering the small Louisiana town in a blanket of humidity that seemed to slow time itself. The cicadas buzzed relentlessly in the dense woods that surrounded the Johnson family property, a once grand plantation house that had fallen into genteel decay over the generations. Margaret Johnson sat on the wraparound porch, slowly fanning herself with yesterday's newspaper, watching her twin daughters, Eliza and Eleanor, playing in the yard. At 12 years old, the girls were identical in almost every way. Same golden curls, same blue eyes that seemed to catch the light like glass marbles, same delicate features. Only Margaret could tell them apart consistently, recognizing subtle differences in their mannerisms that others missed. "Girls, come inside soon. The photographer will be here at 4, Margaret called, her voice carrying across the overgrown lawn where wildflowers had reclaimed what was once a manicured garden. The girls nodded in unison but continued their game, running circles around the ancient oak that dominated the yard, its Spanish moss hanging like phantom curtains in the still air. Inside, Thomas Johnson adjusted his collar in the hallway mirror, the wood-paneled walls behind him darkened with age. Once the Johnson name had meant something in Cypress Creek. The plantation had been profitable, the family respected and feared in equal measure. But the crash of '29 had taken almost everything, leaving them with little more than their name and the crumbling house that had been in the family for generations. "Is this really necessary, Margaret?" Thomas asked when his wife entered, her dress faded but impeccably pressed. "Photographs are an expense we can ill afford." "It's their birthday, Thomas," Margaret replied softly, "and it's tradition. Every Johnson has had their portrait taken on their 12th birthday, since your grandfather's time." Thomas nodded. Knowing better than to argue with Margaret about family traditions, the Johnsons had always been superstitious, and Margaret more than most. When the photographer arrived, a thin man named Elias Carter, who traveled the parish with his equipment in a black Ford Model T, the family assembled in the parlor. The twins wore identical white dresses, their hair pulled back with matching ribbons. "Stand by the window, girls," Elias instructed, positioning his camera on its tripod. "The light is better there." Eleanor took her place first, followed by Eliza. As they stood side by side, a cloud passed over the sun, casting the room in momentary shadow. "Perfect timing," Elias muttered, adjusting his camera. "Hold still now." The flash powder ignited with a bright burst and a puff of acrid smoke. The girls blinked rapidly, spots dancing before their eyes. "One more," Elias said, preparing another plate. "Just to be safe." The second flash illuminated the room again, and Margaret felt a chill despite the summer heat. She crossed herself quickly, an old habit from her Catholic upbringing that Thomas's Protestant family had never fully approved of. "I'll have these developed by next week, Mrs. Johnson," Elias promised as he packed up his equipment. As he left, Margaret noticed Eleanor rubbing her eyes vigorously. "Does it hurt, dear?" she asked, concerned. "No, Mamma," Eleanor replied. "Just feels strange, like someone walking over my grave." Margaret hushed her daughter immediately. "Don't say such things, especially on your birthday." That night, Eleanor developed a fever. Her skin burned to the touch, and she thrashed in her sleep, muttering words that made no sense. Margaret stayed by her bedside, applying cold compresses and praying quietly while Thomas paced the hallway outside. "Should we call for Dr. Bellamy?" Thomas asked around midnight, his face drawn with worry. "He's all the way in New Orleans now," Margaret replied. "Send for Miss Laveau instead." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That old voodoo woman? Margaret, be sensible." "She knows more about fevers than any doctor," Margaret insisted, "and she's closer. Please, Thomas." Reluctantly, Thomas sent their handyman, an elderly black man named Moses, to fetch Constance Laveau from her cabin at the edge of the swamp. The woman arrived an hour later, a small figure wrapped in shawls despite the heat, carrying a battered leather bag of remedies. Constance examined Eleanor carefully, feeling her pulse, looking into her eyes, smelling her breath. She mixed herbs in a small bowl, made a tea that smelled of earth and bitter roots, and helped Margaret coax it down Eleanor's throat. "This child has been touched by something," Constance said finally, her Creole accent thick in the quiet room. "Something that don't belong in this world." "What do you mean?" Thomas demanded from the doorway, where he had been watching with obvious disapproval. Constance ignored him, addressing Margaret instead. "Has anything unusual happened today? Anything out of the ordinary?" Margaret thought about the photograph, the momentary shadow, Eleanor's strange comment afterward. She described these things to Constance, whose weathered face grew increasingly grave. "The camera," Constance murmured. "They say it can capture more than just a person's likeness." "This is superstitious nonsense," Thomas interrupted. "My daughter is ill, and we're wasting time with ghost stories." "Not ghosts, Mr. Johnson," Constance replied, her dark eyes fixing on him. "Something else, something old. These twins, they share more than blood. They share a soul between them." In the bed, Eleanor moaned softly, her eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. "What can we do?" Margaret asked, clutching Constance's gnarled hand. "Keep them apart until the fever breaks," Constance instructed. "Don't let the other child in this room. And when those photographs come, burn them without looking. Promise me this." Margaret nodded solemnly, but Thomas had heard enough. He escorted Constance out, returning with a grim expression. "I've paid the woman, but I won't have any more of this voodoo talk in my house," he declared. "If Eleanor isn't better by morning, I'll go for Dr. Bellamy myself." Pudice. But by morning, Eleanor's fever had broken. She was pale and weak, but lucid, asking for breakfast and wondering why Eliza wasn't allowed to see her. "Just a precaution, dear," Margaret explained, relief evident in her voice. "We don't want Eliza catching your fever." For the next few days, Margaret kept the twins separated, despite their protests and Thomas's insistence that it was unnecessary. Eleanor regained her strength quickly, but Margaret noticed subtle changes in her daughter, a new quietness, a tendency to stare into space, a lack of appetite. When Elias Carter returned with the photographs a week later, Margaret almost refused to accept them, remembering Constance's warning, but Thomas took the envelope, paying Elias and thanking him for his work. "Don't be ridiculous, Margaret," Thomas said, when she suggested burning the photographs unopened. "I paid good money for these." He removed the two prints from the envelope, examined them briefly, then frowned. "Odd," he murmured, handing them to Margaret. The first photograph showed the twins standing by the window as expected, identical in their white dresses, their serious expressions typical of formal portraits of the era. But in the second photograph, something was wrong. The girls stood in the same position, wearing the same expressions, but while Eliza cast a faint shadow on the wall behind her, Eleanor did not. Margaret gasped, nearly dropping the photographs. "It's just a trick of the light," Thomas said dismissively, though his voice held a note of uncertainty, "or a flaw in the development process." Margaret wanted to burn the photographs immediately, but Thomas refused, placing them in the family album that sat on the bookshelf in the parlor. That night, she dreamt of Eleanor standing by her bed, her eyes empty, her feet not quite touching the floor. The next morning, Eliza complained that Eleanor had kept her awake, walking around their shared bedroom in the dark. "I was asleep all night," Eleanor protested when questioned, her voice oddly flat. "I don't sleepwalk." She was standing by the window for hours, just staring out," Eliza insisted. "I called her name, but she wouldn't answer." Margaret separated the girls again that night, having Eliza sleep in the small sewing room across the hall. Around midnight, she awoke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. Peering out, she saw Eleanor walking slowly toward the stairs, her white nightgown ghostly in the darkness. "Eleanor?" Margaret called softly, not wanting to wake the household. "Where are you going, child?" Eleanor turned, and in the dim light filtering through the windows, her eyes seemed completely black, without pupil or iris. "To the water." Eleanor replied in a voice that didn't sound like her own. "They're calling me." Margaret rushed to her daughter, grasping her by the shoulders. Eleanor's skin was ice cold despite the summer heat that persisted even at night. "Who's calling you?" Margaret demanded, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Eleanor didn't answer, but her gaze shifted to look over Margaret's shoulder. Margaret turned but saw nothing in the dark hallway behind her. When she looked back, Eleanor's eyes had returned to normal, and she seemed confused. "Mama? Why am I out of bed?" Margaret led Eleanor back to her room, tucking her in and sitting by her bedside until the girl fell asleep again. In the morning, she sent Moses with a note asking Constance Laveau to return. The old woman arrived as the sun was setting, bringing with her a small cloth doll and various herbs and powders. She examined Eleanor again, this time shaking her head gravely. "It's worse than I feared," Constance said when she and Margaret were alone in the kitchen. "Something is trying to take your child's place. Something from the other side of the veil." "What can we do?" Margaret asked, fighting back tears. "The photographs," Constance said firmly. "We must destroy them, and then we must cleanse this house and protect your daughters." This time, Margaret didn't wait for Thomas's approval. She retrieved the family album from the parlour, while Constance prepared a mixture of salt, herbs, and what looked like bone dust in a small bowl. Together they took the photographs out to the stone fire pit in the back garden. Constance lit a fire, murmuring words in a language Margaret didn't understand, while Margaret held the photographs with trembling hands. "Cast them into the flames," Constance instructed, "and don't look at them as they burn." Margaret did as she was told, dropping the photographs into the fire and quickly averting her eyes. Even so, she couldn't help but notice how the flames turned an unnatural blue-green color, how they seemed to whisper as they consumed the paper. "Now, we must protect your daughters," Constance said, leading Margaret back inside, "especially the one it has marked." They found Eleanor in the parlour, standing perfectly still, staring at the empty space on the bookshelf where the family album had been. "You took them," Eleanor said, her voice eerily calm. "You took the pictures." "Yes, dear," Margaret replied, trying to sound normal. "They weren't very good. We'll have new ones taken soon." Eleanor turned to look at them, and for a moment Margaret saw something ancient and hungry in her daughter's eyes. "It won't matter," Eleanor said softly. "They've already seen me. They know I'm here now." Constance stepped forward, holding the cloth doll she had brought. "Come here, child," she said firmly. "I have something for you." Eleanor didn't move, her gaze fixed on Constance with open hostility. "She doesn't belong here," Eleanor said to Margaret. "Send her away." "Eleanor Johnson," Margaret said sternly, falling back on maternal authority to mask her fear. "Mind your manners and do as you're told." For a tense moment it seemed Eleanor might refuse. Then slowly she approached Constance, who pressed the doll into her hands. "Keep this with you," Constance told her. "Always. It will protect you." Eleanor looked down at the doll, which was crudely made, but had Eleanor's golden hair sewn into its head and was dressed in a scrap of fabric from one of Eleanor's dresses. "It won't work," Eleanor said quietly. "Nothing will." That night, Margaret insisted the twins sleep in separate rooms again. She placed lines of salt across the thresholds and windows, as Constance had instructed, and hung small bags of protective herbs above each bed. Thomas watched these proceedings with growing alarm, but held his tongue, shaken by the change in Eleanor and the inexplicable photograph. In the deepest part of the night, Margaret awoke to Eliza's screams. She rushed to the sewing room to find Eliza pressed against the headboard of her bed, pointing at the window where a figure stood silhouetted against the moonlight. "She's trying to get in," Eliza sobbed. "She looks like Eleanor, but she's not. She's not." Margaret saw nothing at the window, but threw open the door to Eleanor's room across the hall. The bed was empty, the window open, the salt line broken. Thomas was awake now too, lighting oil lamps and calling Eleanor's name. They searched the house, finding no sign of her until Moses, roused by the commotion, pointed outside. "There," he said, his voice hushed with dread. "By the old oak." Eleanor stood beneath the massive tree, her white nightgown billowing slightly in a breeze that seemed to touch nothing else. As they watched, she turned and began walking toward the swamp that bordered the property, her movements stiff and unnatural. "Eleanor!" Margaret cried, running barefoot across the dew-soaked grass. "Eleanor, stop!" Eleanor didn't slow or turn, continuing her steady progress toward the dark line of cypress trees that marked the beginning of the swamp. Thomas overtook Margaret, reaching Eleanor just before she entered the tree line and grasping her arm. Eleanor turned then, and what they saw made both parents recoil. Her face was Eleanor's, but her expression was wrong. A twisted smile that showed too many teeth, eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's. "Let go," Eleanor said, her voice overlaid with something older, something that rasped like scales on stone. "She belongs to us now." "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, maintaining his grip on his daughter's arm despite his horror. "What have you done with my child?" The thing wearing Eleanor's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I am the one who waited in the dark, the one who saw its chance when your machine captured her essence, the one who has been so hungry for so long." Margaret reached them, clutching the protective doll Constance had made. "Let her go," she commanded, holding the doll out like a weapon. "In the name of God and all his angels, let my daughter go," the creature hissed, Eleanor's features contorting in rage. "She invited me in," it snarled. When the light flashed and her soul was momentarily untethered, just for an instant, but long enough. "She's mine now." "No," came a small voice from behind them. Eliza stood there, barefoot in her nightgown, her face tear-streaked but determined. "She's my sister, my twin. We share everything, always have, always will." Eliza stepped forward, reaching for Eleanor's free hand. "Even our soul." "Stay back," Margaret warned, terrified of what might happen if the creature touched Eliza as well. But Eliza ignored her, grasping Eleanor's cold hand firmly. "I know you're in there, Ellie," she said, using her private nickname for her sister. "I know you can hear me. Fight it. Come back to us." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Eleanor's body began to tremble, her eyes rolling back in her head, her mouth opening in a silent scream. A wind rose from nowhere, whipping around them, carrying the scent of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. "The photograph," Eleanor gasped, her voice momentarily her own again. "Burn it, all of it." "We did," Margaret cried, holding on to her daughters as the wind threatened to tear them apart. "We burned the photographs." "The negative," Eleanor managed before her voice changed again, becoming the rasping hiss of the creature. "Too late, too late." Thomas suddenly understood. "The negative plates. Carter still has them." The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, and Eleanor collapsed, her body going limp in their arms. Thomas carried her back to the house, where they laid her on her bed. Her breathing was shallow, her skin grey in the lamplight. "I'll go to Carter's at first light," Thomas promised, his face haggard with fear and exhaustion. "I'll get the negatives and destroy them." "It might be too late by then," Margaret said, watching as Eleanor's chest barely rose and fell. "Look at her, she's fading." "I'll go now," Moses offered from the doorway. "I know where he lives. I can take the Model T." Thomas hesitated only briefly, before nodding and handing Moses the keys. "Be careful, and be quick." While they waited, Margaret and Eliza sat by Eleanor's bedside, holding her hands, talking to her, trying to keep her connected to the world of the living. Thomas paced the room, pausing occasionally to look out the window for any sign of Moses's return. As the first light of dawn broke over the cypress trees, they heard the sputtering engine of the Model T returning. Thomas rushed downstairs, returning moments later with a wooden box containing Elias Carter's glass plate negatives. "Carter wasn't happy about being woken," Thomas said grimly, "but he changed his tune when I offered him twice what the photographs cost." Margaret took the box with trembling hands. "We need to destroy them completely, shatter the glass, burn any fragments." They took the negatives out to the stone fire pit where the photographs had been burned the night before. Thomas smashed each glass plate with a hammer, then built a fire over the shards. Margaret added the herbs Constance had left, while Eliza stood watching, holding her unconscious sister upright. As the fire consumed the broken negatives, Eleanor suddenly gasped, her eyes flying open. She coughed violently, doubling over, black liquid spilling from her mouth onto the ground, where it sizzled and evaporated. "Ellie?" Eliza said tentatively, still supporting her sister. Eleanor looked up, her eyes clear and her own again. "Liza," she breathed, "you pulled me back." The family clung to each other as the fire burned down to embers, the crisis seemingly past. But in the weeks that followed, they noticed changes in Eleanor. She was quieter, more thoughtful. She had nightmares she refused to discuss. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her gaze would drift to the edge of the swamp, a mixture of longing and fear in her eyes. The Johnsons never had another photograph taken. The old family album disappeared, reportedly burned by Margaret, though some said she buried it at a crossroads at midnight. Elias Carter's photography business failed the following year after a series of strange accidents and inexplicable images appearing in his work. And though the twins remained close, people in Cypress Creek began to notice differences between them for the first time. Where once they had been indistinguishable, now Eleanor seemed older somehow, her eyes holding knowledge no child should possess, her shadow sometimes appearing to move independently of her body when the light hit it just so. Louisiana, 1952. The rain fell in sheets across the cemetery, turning the ground to mud and flooding the lower sections where the oldest graves stood in crooked rows. Eliza Johnson Matthews stood under a black umbrella, watching as her twin sister's casket was lowered into the sodden earth. At 32 years old, Eliza was now alone, for the first time in her life. Eleanor had died suddenly, found in her bed with no apparent cause, her face frozen in an expression of terror. The doctor had called it a heart condition, but Eliza knew better. She had felt it happen, a sudden wrenching sensation in the middle of the night, as if part of her soul had been violently torn away. "Mrs. Matthews," a voice said behind her. Eliza turned to see an elderly black woman, stooped with age but with clear, piercing eyes. It took her a moment to recognize Constance Laveau, now well into her 80s, but still very much alive. "Miss Laveau," Eliza acknowledged, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I felt it," Constance said simply, "the moment she was taken, just like I felt it 20 years ago when it first found her." Eliza glanced around nervously, but the other mourners were dispersing, hurrying to their cars to escape the downpour. Only her husband Robert remained, waiting patiently by their Cadillac, watching the exchange with curious eyes. "We don't talk about that," Eliza said quietly. "Not ever." "You need to talk about it now," Constance replied, grasping Eliza's wrist with surprising strength. "Because it's not over. It was never over. It was just waiting." Eliza pulled her arm away. "Eleanor is dead. Whatever happened to her, whatever took her, it's done now." Constance shook her head slowly. "Death isn't the end. You know that. You've always known that. Why do you think she never married? Never had children? She was protecting them from what she carried inside." A chill ran through Eliza that had nothing to do with the rain. It was true that Eleanor had remained single, becoming increasingly reclusive over the years, living alone in the old Johnson house after their parents died. Eliza had married Robert Matthews, a successful lawyer, and moved to New Orleans, visiting her sister less and less frequently as Eleanor's behavior grew more erratic. "What do you want from me?" Eliza asked, suddenly weary. "Come to my place tonight," Constance said. "Bring something that belonged to her, something personal. We need to make sure she rests peacefully." Eliza wanted to refuse, to dismiss the old woman's superstitions as she had been doing for years, trying to forget the terror of that night in 1932. But the memory of Eleanor's face in death, that frozen mask of horror, made her nod reluctantly. "I'll come after dark," she promised. Robert asked no questions when Eliza told him she needed to visit an old family friend that evening, though his eyes showed concern. Their marriage was one of mutual respect and companionable affection rather than passion, and he had long ago accepted that there were parts of his wife's past and inner life that remained closed to him. Constance Laveau's cabin had changed little over the decades, still standing at the edge of the swamp, though the surrounding area had been developed with new houses pushing ever closer to the wetlands. Eliza parked her car on the narrow dirt track and made her way to the door, carrying a small leather-bound journal that had belonged to Eleanor. Constance was waiting for her, the cabin lit by oil lamps that cast jumping shadows on the walls. The single room was neat but crowded with strange objects, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves lined with jars containing unidentifiable substances, a table covered with bones, feathers, and small carved figures. "Sit," Constance instructed, pointing to a chair by the table, "and give me what you brought." Eliza handed over the journal, watching as Constance handled it reverently, closing her eyes and running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "She knew it was coming back for her," Constance murmured. "She wrote about it here." "You can't possibly know that without reading it," Eliza protested. Constance opened the journal, turning unerringly to a page near the end. "Read," she said, pushing the book toward Eliza. In Eleanor's precise handwriting, Eliza read, April 17th, 1952. "It's getting stronger. I can feel it pushing at the edges of my consciousness, especially at night. The barriers Constance helped me build are failing. I dream of the swamp, of dark water and things moving beneath the surface. I dream of the photograph that started it all, the one where my shadow was gone. In the dream, I'm standing beside myself, watching as I slowly fade away, while something else takes my place. I haven't told Eliza. What could she do? She has her own life now, her husband, her social circle in New Orleans. And part of me fears that if it can't have me completely, it might reach for her next. We still share that connection, that twinning of our souls that made me vulnerable in the first place. If anyone finds this after I'm gone, know that I didn't leave willingly, know that I fought, and know that it might not end with me." Eliza looked up, her face pale. "This is dated just 2 weeks ago." "Ooh, she came to me last month," Constance said, taking the journal back. "Asked me to strengthen the protections. I did what I could, but she was already too far gone. It had been eating away at her for 20 years, patient, relentless." "What is it?" Eliza asked, the question she had never dared to ask as a child. "What took my sister?" Constance sighed, suddenly looking every one of her years. The old ones called them soul-eaters, spirits that were never human, that exist in the spaces between this world and the next. They're always hungry, always looking for a way in. Usually, they can only touch our world in dreams or at crossroads, liminal spaces where the barriers are thin. But sometimes they find other doors. "Like a photograph," Eliza whispered. "The old Cajuns believed that cameras could steal a piece of your soul." Constance nodded, not far from the truth. The moment of capture, when light and chemicals fix your image, there's a split second where your essence is exposed, vulnerable. Most times nothing happens, but that day, with you two, she shook her head. Twins already have one foot in the spirit world. 2 bodies, 1 soul split between them, and it was your birthday, a time of transition. Too many doorways open at once. Eliza thought of Eleanor's lifelong struggle, the nightmares, the odd behaviors, the growing isolation. She suffered for 20 years because of a photograph. Because of what came through when that photograph was taken, Constance corrected. And now that she's gone, we need to make sure it went with her. How do we do that? Constance began gathering items from around the cabin. Candles, a small bowl of water, salt, a curved knife with symbols carved into the handle. "We call her Spirit and ask her." "A séance?" Eliza said incredulously. "That's your solution?" "Not just any séance," Constance replied grimly. "A summoning. And it's dangerous, for both of us, but it's the only way to know for certain. Despite her misgivings, Eliza helped Constance prepare the ritual. They cleared the table, placing candles at specific points, drawing symbols in salt, setting Eleanor's journal in the center. Constance cut a lock of Eliza's hair with the curved knife, placing it beside the journal. "Blood would be better," Constance commented, "but hair will do. The twin connection is strong enough." "What exactly are we trying to do?" Eliza asked as Constance lit the candles. "First, we need to know if Eleanor's spirit is at rest," Constance explained. "If it is, then the thing that haunted her died with her, or at least lost its hold in this world. If not," she paused, "if not, then it's still here, perhaps still holding part of her soul captive, or worse, looking for a new host." "A new host," Eliza repeated slowly. "You mean me?" Constance met her eyes steadily. "You share the same blood, the same soul essence. You're the most obvious target." A chill ran through Eliza. "Let's get this over with." Constance nodded, taking Eliza's hands across the table. "Close your eyes. Think of Eleanor, not as you last saw her, but as she was when you were children, before all this began. Call to her in your mind." Eliza did as instructed, picturing Eleanor at 12, golden curls bouncing as they ran around the old oak tree, laughing. She felt a familiar ache of loss, sharper now than it had been at the funeral. "Ellie," she called silently. "Ellie, are you there?" Constance began to chant in a mixture of French, Latin, and what might have been African languages. The candle flames stretched tall, casting elongated shadows on the walls. The air in the cabin grew heavy, charged like the atmosphere before a storm. Eliza kept her eyes closed, but she could sense changes in the room, a drop in temperature, a pressure against her eardrums, a scent like river mud and decay. Constance's chanting grew more insistent, her grip on Eliza's hands painfully tight. And then Eliza felt it, a presence. Not beside her or across from her, but inside her, as if someone had stepped into her skin. Her eyes flew open in panic. "Constance!" she gasped. "Something's wrong!" Constance was staring at her with a mixture of awe and horror. "Eleanor," she whispered, "is that you?" Eliza felt her mouth move, heard her voice speak, but the words weren't hers. "Help me," her voice said, thin and desperate. "It won't let go. Even in death it won't let go." "Eleanor," Constance said firmly, "tell us what happened. Tell us how to help you." Eliza felt her body shudder, her back arching slightly. When she spoke again, her voice was strange, distant. "It ate me slowly, year by year. Took my joy first, then my hopes, my connections to others. By the end, I was mostly gone already. When my heart stopped, it should have ended, but it still holds part of me. In the house, in the walls." "The Johnson house?" Constance asked. Eliza's head nodded jerkily. "Under the floorboards in my room, the photograph. I found it, hid it, couldn't destroy it." "What photograph?" Constance demanded. "The one we burned." "Another one. Carter took 3 that day, not 2. The last plate. I found it among his things after he died. It was worse than the others. In it, I'm looking at the camera, but behind me," Eliza's voice broke, "behind me you can see it, its true form, reflected in the mirror." Constance inhaled sharply. "You should have destroyed it." "I tried. It wouldn't burn, wouldn't break. So I hid it. Sealed it in iron and silver, buried it under the house, but it's still there, still active. And now it's looking for a new host." Eliza's eyes, moving independently of her will, fixed on Constance. "It wants Eliza. It's always wanted both of us." A violent tremor ran through Eliza's body, and she slumped forward onto the table, breaking Constance's grip. When she raised her head a moment later, she was herself again, shaking and nauseated. "What happened?" she asked, her throat raw as if she'd been screaming. "Eleanor came through," Constance said, her face grave, "and we have our answer. It's not over." "We have to find that photograph," Eliza said, pushing herself upright. "Destroy it properly this time." Constance nodded. And we have to do it tonight. The barrier between worlds is thinner now, with Eleanor newly passed. If we wait, the thing might find another way to cross over, with or without the photograph. They drove to the old Johnson house in Eliza's car, the headlights cutting through the misty rain that continued to fall. The house had been closed up since Eleanor's death 3 days ago, the windows dark, the garden already beginning to look neglected. Eliza used her key to open the front door, which creaked ominously as it swung inward. The air inside was stale and heavy with the scent of the flowers that had been delivered for Eleanor's wake. In the darkness, their wilting blooms looked like huddled mourners. "We need light," Constance said, fumbling for the switch. The electricity had been turned off, so they used flashlights, their beams creating shifting islands of visibility in the gloom. They made their way upstairs to Eleanor's bedroom, a room that Eliza had always found uncomfortable to visit in recent years. Eleanor had covered the walls with strange symbols drawn in charcoal, and the furniture was arranged in precise geometric patterns that she claimed protected her while she slept. Where under the floorboards? Eliza wondered aloud, sweeping her flashlight across the wooden floor. "Look for signs," Constance advised. "Marks, discoloration, anything that seems out of place." They searched methodically, moving furniture, tapping boards, looking for hollow sounds or loose planks. Finally, Eliza noticed something, a small design carved into one floorboard near the center of the room, partially hidden by a rug. It was a spiral within a circle, with lines radiating outward like a stylized sun. "Here," she called to Constance, who was checking the closet. "I think I found something." Together, they rolled back the rug completely, revealing more symbols carved into the surrounding floorboards, protective sigils that Eliza recognized from the bags and charms Constance had made for them 20 years ago. "She was containing it," Constance murmured, kneeling stiffly to examine the marks, keeping it trapped. Using a letter opener from Eleanor's desk, they pried up the central board. Beneath it was a small iron box, its lid solid shut and inscribed with more protective symbols. Silver wire had been wrapped around it multiple times, secured with what looked like dried clay, mixed with herbs and possibly blood. "Don't touch it with your bare hands," Constance warned as Eliza reached for the box. "Use something as a barrier." Eliza found a pair of Eleanor's gloves in a drawer and put them on before carefully lifting the box from its hiding place. It was surprisingly heavy for its size and unnaturally cold. "Now what?" she asked, holding the box away from her body. "We need to destroy it completely," Constance said. "Not just burn it this time. It needs to be unmade." They carried the box downstairs and out to the backyard, where the old stone fire pit still stood, though it hadn't been used in years. The rain had slackened to a drizzle, but the ground was muddy and slick under their feet. "How do we open it?" Eliza asked. Placing the box on the edge of the fire pit, Constance reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of clear liquid. "Oil of vitriol," she explained. "Sulfuric acid. It will eat through the solder." "Where did you get that?" Eliza asked, surprised. "I have my sources," Constance replied with a grim smile. "Stand back. Don't breathe the fumes." Carefully, Constance applied drops of the acid to the seam where the box was soldered shut. The metal hissed and bubbled, a acrid smoke rising into the damp night air. After a few minutes, she used a pair of pliers from her bag to test the lid, which now moved slightly. "That's enough," she said, setting aside the acid. "Now we prepare the fire." From her seemingly bottomless bag, Constance produced packets of herbs, salts, and powders, which she arranged around the fire pit in specific patterns. She instructed Eliza to gather wood, which they found in a small shed behind the house, thankfully dry enough to burn. As they built the fire, Constance explained what would happen next. "When we open the box, don't look directly at the photograph. Whatever you do, don't meet its eyes if you see a figure in it. That's how it reaches out." "Then how do we destroy it safely?" Eliza asked. "I'll handle the photograph," Constance said. "You'll maintain the fire and recite the words I teach you. Together, we'll send it back to where it came from and free what remains of Eleanor's spirit. The fire blazed up, unnaturally bright in the misty darkness. Constance taught Eliza a chant, in what sounded like a mixture of French and an older language, making her repeat it until she had the pronunciation perfect. "Ready?" Constance asked finally, positioning herself across the fire from Eliza. Eliza nodded, her heart pounding with fear and determination. Using the pliers, Constance carefully opened the iron box, keeping her gaze averted from its contents. With a gloved hand, she reached inside and extracted something flat and rectangular, the missing photographic plate. Eliza began the chant as instructed, her voice steadier than she expected. Constance held the photograph over the fire, still not looking at it, and began her own incantation, her aged voice cracking with the effort. The flames changed color, shifting from orange to blue to a sickly green. The air around them grew dense, pressing against their skin like a physical weight. Eliza continued chanting, even as the words seemed to stick in her throat, as if something was trying to prevent her from speaking them. And then she heard it, a voice, Eleanor's voice, but wrong somehow, distorted. "Liza," it called. "Liza, look at me, please. I need you to see me one last time." Despite Constance's warning, Eliza's eyes were drawn to the photograph in the old woman's trembling hands. She caught a glimpse of what appeared to be Eleanor standing by the window, just as in the original portrait. But behind her, reflected in the window glass, was something else, a form that seemed to shift and change, even as Eliza tried to comprehend it. Something with too many limbs and eyes that burned like embers. "Don't stop the chant!" Constance shouted, her voice breaking through Eliza's horrified trance. Eliza wrenched her gaze away from the photograph and resumed chanting, her voice shaking now. The pressure in the air increased, and the fire roared higher, sparks flying upward to vanish in the drizzling rain. Constance dropped the photograph into the fire, where it landed with a sound like a scream. The flames engulfed it instantly, burning with unnatural intensity. Eliza continued chanting, even as the ground beneath them began to tremble and the shadows around the fire pit seemed to move independently, reaching toward them with grasping fingers of darkness. "It's fighting!" Constance gasped, her face contorted with effort as she sprinkled more powders into the fire. "Keep going!" "Ooh!" The photograph in the flames began to change, the image on it shifting and moving as if alive. Eliza saw Eleanor's face transform, her features melting and reforming into something inhuman. The figure behind her grew more distinct, pushing forward as if trying to break through the surface of the photograph into the world. "No," Eliza whispered, momentarily breaking the chant. "You can't have her. Not again." She reached into the fire with her gloved hand, grasping the edge of the photograph, ignoring the heat that penetrated the fabric. With her other hand, she pulled Eleanor's journal from her coat pocket and thrust it into the flames as well. "What are you doing?" Constance cried, alarmed. "Giving it an anchor," Eliza said grimly, resuming the chant with renewed vigor. The journal and photograph burned together, their pages curling and blackening. As they did, Eliza felt something tear inside her. The connection she had always shared with Eleanor, the twin bond that had remained even after death. It was like losing her sister all over again, a pain so acute she nearly collapsed. But with that pain came a sense of lightness, of release. The pressure in the air dissipated, the shadows retreated, and the fire returned to its natural color, burning steadily despite the light rain. "It's done," Constance said finally, her voice hoarse. "The doorway is closed." Eliza sank to her knees in the mud, exhausted beyond words. "Is she free?" she asked. "Is Eleanor at peace now?" Constance nodded slowly. "What remained of her is free. The thing that took her is gone, at least from this world. It may find another way back someday, but not through you or your sister." They stayed by the fire until it burned down to embers, ensuring that nothing remained of the photograph or the journal. As dawn broke over the cypress trees, casting pale light through the mist, Eliza felt a presence beside her, not the invading force she had experienced during the séance, but something gentler, familiar. "Thank you," she thought she heard on the morning breeze. "Goodbye, Eliza." And then it was gone, leaving only the scent of rain and wood smoke. Eliza sold the Johnson house later that year, using the money to establish a small foundation in Eleanor's name to support research into heart disease. She never spoke of what had happened, not even to her husband, though sometimes she woke in the night with the certainty that she was being watched by something ancient and hungry. Constance Laveau died peacefully in her sleep 6 months after the ritual, having finally fulfilled her promise to Margaret Johnson to protect her daughters. Her cabin was demolished to make way for new development, but locals claimed the land remained barren, nothing growing where her home had once stood. And in Cypress Creek, people sometimes reported seeing 2 identical women walking beneath the old oak tree on the former Johnson property, visible only at dusk or dawn, their golden hair catching the light as they moved in perfect synchronicity, their shadows merging into one. Louisiana, 1982. The envelope arrived on Sarah Matthews' 30th birthday, yellowed with age and bearing her grandmother's precise handwriting. Sarah's mother, Caroline, handed it to her with a puzzled expression. "It was in a safety deposit box with instructions to give it to you today," Caroline explained. "Mum set it up before she died." Eliza Matthews had passed away 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, leaving behind a grieving family and a collection of antiques and heirlooms that no one quite knew what to do with. Sarah, her only grandchild, had been especially close to her, fascinated by the old woman's stories of growing up in rural Louisiana during the Depression. "What is it?" Sarah asked, turning the envelope over in her hands. It was sealed with wax, impressed with a symbol she didn't recognize, a spiral within a circle. "I have no idea," Caroline replied. "You know how Mom was about family history. Probably some old photographs or letters she wanted you to have." Sarah carefully broke the seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a small key taped to a piece of paper with an address in New Orleans. The letter, written in Eliza's elegant script, began simply, "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have reached your 30th birthday. I have always seen so much of myself in you, and by extension, so much of Eleanor. It is because of this resemblance that I must burden you with a truth I have kept hidden for most of my life. You have heard the stories of my twin sister who died young, but I have never told you how she died, or what happened before and after. It is a dark tale, one I hoped would end with me, but signs and portents suggest otherwise, and so I must prepare you. The key enclosed will open a storage unit in New Orleans, where I have kept records and items related to what happened. Go there alone. Read everything before you decide what to do next. Trust your instincts, but also trust Constance Laveau's warnings. They saved my life once. I am sorry to place this weight on your shoulders, but you are stronger than you know. You are a Johnson woman, after all, even if you bear the Matthews name." With love and regret, Grandmother Eliza Sarah looked up from the letter, confused and intrigued. "Mom, did Grandma ever talk to you about how her sister died?" Caroline shook her head. "She wouldn't discuss it. I gathered it was sudden and traumatic. Why?"